Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Lamed Dalid contains two Mishnayos and three Sugyas. From the beginning of the Daf to the first Mishnah is discussing the identity of the Arava. We'll refer to three different types of Aravos. There's the Arava, there's the Tzaftzfa, and there's the Gila. Identify which one is which and which ones are kosher. Then we get to the next Mishnah, which discusses how many of each min of the Daled minim we are supposed to take, and a couple of opinions as to when they are kosher. And then we'll get to the next Mishnah, which begins the halachos of the esrog. So first of all, the daf begins with a discussion of what the Torah means when it says arava. So it says arvei nachal. The language arvei, plural, includes some type of arava, but it does say arvei nachal, which means that it has to grow on the riverbank. So we're including some type of arava, we're excluding some type of arava. What type of arava is included and what type of arava is excluded? So we'll talk about the regular arava, which grows on the banks of the river. We'll talk about the tzaftafa, which the Gemara says grows in the mountains. And then later in the daf, we'll introduce the gila, which has a different shape. So the Gemara says, arvei nachal has got to be river, so that excludes the tzaftafa, which is a type of arava that grows on the mountains, not near the banks of the river. The Gemara says you need another pasuk to show that the tzaftafa is a different, inferior type of arava. You can't just tell me that it's excluding the tzaftafa because it doesn't grow on the banks of the river. So the Gemara says it comes from a pasuk in Yecheskel that says Kachal Mayim Rabim Tzaftafa Samai, which the Gemara interprets. There's two different versions here, whether this is an Amira saying it or it's part of the Brisa, but it's interpreted as referring to something which could have been an arava. And that's what Kachal Mayim Rabim is. Take something which grows on many waters, that's referring to an arava. And instead, Tzaftafa Sama, you made it an inferior plant, you made it just a Tzaftafa. So the Gemara says, Abaya asks, or in the second version, Rabbi Zera asked, how do you know that that's how you're supposed to interpret this pasuk? There's one thing called a Kachal Mayim Rabim, which is an arava, and there's a different inferior thing called a Tzaftafa. How do you know? Maybe it's explaining this Kachal Mayim Rabim, and that's the Tzaftafa. Meaning Tzaftafa is another name, or it's very similar, it's the same min as the arava which grows on many waters. So Gemara says if that would be the case, it wouldn't make sense to say Tzaftafa Samai. Tzaftafa Samai means you turned it into a Tzaftafa. Obviously you're talking about something else. You're talking about the Kachal Mayim Rabim, and you took that and turned it into the Tzaftafa. Okay, now the Gemara just explains that this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's musar to Klal Yisrael. You could have been a higher level, you could have been an arava. Instead, you became just a tzaftafa. Okay, now the Gemara brings a brisa, which identifies by physical signs what's an arava and what's a tzaftafa. So the brisa says an arava has a red stem, its leaves are long and thin, they're elongated, and the edges of the leaves are smooth. Tzaftafa, on the other hand, has all those three things are different. The stem is white, the leaves are rounded, not long and thin, and the leaves are serrated like a sickle. Now, a sickle is serrated by spikes that all poke in one direction, not quite like a saw. A saw would have square spikes that are very large and sharp, and they poke in both directions, so it's not that bad. So this is what the tzaftafa is. So the Gemara says, but I have a question on this. There's a different brisa that says that any plant that's leaves are serrated like a saw, that's puzzle, but if it's serrated like a sickle, then it's kosher. So your tzaftafa, which you're describing, is serrated like a sickle, that should be kosher. Gemara says, no. There's a different plant that Bryce is referring to, which is like an arava in the other two senses. It has a red stem and an elongated leaf, but it has serrations on the leaf like a sickle. That's a different plant. That's a plant called a gila, or chilfa gila, and that is a kosher plant. So the Gemara quotes Abaye, says chilfa gila is a kosher plant. The Gemara says for sure it is. Why not? The Gemara says because it has a different name. It's called a chilfa gila. It's not called a regular arava. It's called a different name. And we have a rule that anything with a different name is not kosher. Like a different type of, like a maror plant. It has a different name in addition to being called maror is not kosher to be used for maror. So Gemara says this is different because the Torah doesn't call it arava specifically. It says arvei nachal, plural. It talks about willows that grow on the nachal, and this is also a species of arava, of the plural aravos that are included. Okay, now the Gemara brings a number of examples of things that their names have changed. And it's important to know that you have two different things that used to go by one set of names, and they swapped names. And you need to know that. So the Gemara says, first of all, one example is the chalfasa and the arvasa. That's the chilfa and the arava. And that's this plant we're referring to now, and the regular arava. You have to know which is which as far as halachos lulav. Next is a trumpet and a shofar, a chatzorta and a shipura. Versus they switch names, you have to know which one's which. As far as halachos Rosh Hashanah, you have to use a shofar, a curved ram's horn, not a trumpet, not a straight metal horn. Now, next thing is a pesura and a pesurta. Those are two types of tables. One is large, one is small. The names swap. They used to be one way, then they switched to the other way. You need to know that concerning commerce. If you make a deal with somebody to supply one type of table, you have to know which type of table you're supposed to supply. Otherwise, you get into conflicts. Now, Abai says there's another example of two things whose names have switched, and that's the beikasi and the hovlila. These are two of the organs of the stomach of a cow. The cow has 4 different compartments within its stomach. In Hilchos Treifos, if a needle is found in the lining of one of them, it's kosher because it has a thick wall, and you assume it didn't make a hole through and through that allows the food to leak. If it's in the other one, a different compartment of the stomach, it has a very thin wall, and there's a needle in there, you assume that it made a hole through and through, and it's treif because you assume that the food is going to leak and cause the death of the animal. So one is one halacha and the other is the other way. Rashi suggests which one's which, and therefore you need to know which one is the name of which organ. The Gemara says there's another thing you need to know. According to Rava Bar Yosef, he says that Bavel and Borsif switch names. What was called Bavel is now called Borsif. What was called Borsif is now called Bavel. And you need to know that concerning the halachos of a get, somebody who sends a bill of divorce. If it's sent from a place where people are learning, you could assume that they kept the halachos properly. Then the person who brings it does not have to testify that it was written and signed in front of him. And Bavel qualifies for that. Borsif did not. So you have to know which place is which because they switched names. Okay, this brings us to our next Mishnah, which introduces the halacha of how many lulavim, aravos, hadassim, and esogim do you need to bring. So there are 3 opinions here. Rabbi Shmuel says it the way we do it: 3 hadassim, 2 aravos, 1 lulav, and 1 esrog. Rabbi Shmuel adds a halacha, which the Gemara will explain is contradicting his previous halacha. He says that the hadassim, it's okay if 2 of them have the tops cut off. And the Gemara will explain that that can't be. If tops cut off is kosher, so then they all should have to have the tops on. And if tops cut off is puzzle, then all 3 should have to have the tops on. And if tops cut off is kosher, then it should make a difference how many of them have it on. Why does he say 2 have to have it on and 1 not? The Gemara says he's changing his mind here. He's saying you really only have to have 1 hadas. Now, the second opinion here is Rabbi Tarfon. He just argues on how many tops could be cut off. He says it doesn't matter. They could all have the tops cut off. Tops being cut off is not a psul. Tops being cut off is usually just a problem of hadar, and hadar is not a rule that applies to hadassim. Rabbi Kiva says 1 of each. 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 1 hadas, and 1 arava. That's all you need. Gemara brings a brisa, which is very similar. Rabbi Shmuel says pre-eitz hadar. The pasuk defining an esrog, pre-eitz hadar, says you have to bring 1 pre, so you only have to bring 1. Kapas tamarim, you have to bring 1 branch. Kapai, it's pronounced kapos, but it's written kapas. That means just 1. However, anaf eitz avos, which is the words to describe the branches of a hadas. Anaf is 1, eitz is 2, avos is 3. If you have to have 3 of them, and arve is plural. Willows, you have to have 2 aravos. Then Rabbi Elazar says again, the hadassim was okay if 2 of them have the heads cut off. The Gemara asks the question, how could you have heads cut off? The Gemara says that he changed his mind. But continuing the brisa, again, Rabbi Tarfon says all 3 are okay, even if the tops are cut off, it's not a problem. And Rabbi Kiva says 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 1 hadas, and 1 arava. Rabbi Eliezer here adds another halacha. The Gemara, he says that the esrog does not have to be tied together with the other 3. How do you know? Because when the Torah describes it, it says you should bring a pre-eitz hadar. And then it says, and you should bring a kapes tamarim. It does not say, and kapes tamarim. It says, pre-eitz hadar, kapes tamarim. It doesn't say, vik kapes tamarim. It says, pre-eitz hadar, kapes tamarim, without an and. And therefore, the pre-eitz hadar, the esrog, and the kapes tamarim, the lulav do not have to be tied together. However, after kapes tamarim, it does say, ve'anaf eitz avos, ve'arve nachal, and therefore those 3 do have to be tied together. Now, since you have to have all 4, how do you know the esrog doesn't have to be tied to them. How do you know you have to have all four of them? How do you know if one of them is missing, he can't do any mitzvah at all with the other three? There is no partial credit over here. So the says because the Torah says lekachtem lachem. Lekachtem, the word lekachtem is a contraction of lekicha tama. It should be complete taking. You have to take them all. Okay. Now the Gemara goes further. Who's the halacha like? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda's name is Shmuel. The halacha is like Rabbi Tarfon, one of each. Shmuel goes according to his own opinion. The Gemara says because we find a different situation like that where Shmuel used to tell people who sold hadassim, then make sure you sell it for a fair price. Otherwise, I will publicize the fact that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, and people could use chopped off hadassim. They could use ones with the tops missing. He said that because he would have taken that step, because that would have lowered the price, because there would be far more hadassim available on the market. So the Gemara says if he wants to be makeup, wants to be lenient, why does he just say the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva? You only need to have one hadas. People wouldn't have to spend so much. So the Gemara says because it's easier to find 3 chopped hadassim than it is to find 1 unchopped hadas, and therefore this was lowering the price even more. Okay, now we get to the next Mishnah, and this will end the daf, this Mishnah. And this teaches us halachas of the esrog. So first of all, the same halachas of psul, which we've seen before, all apply to an esrog, plus a few more. So the halachas we've seen is that anything which is dried, or from an ashera tree, from an erani dachas, is pasul. Stolen esrog is pasul as well. Now, there's several halachas which apply uniquely to esrog because it's a fruit. Orla is a problem. All these, anything which makes the fruit usher, which you cannot have it, would be usher for you to use. It has to be an esrog that you could use as a normal fruit. So it can't be orla, it can't be truma, which became tameh. Now, as far as truma, which is still tahar, so it's better not to use it, but if you do, it's kosher. The Gemara will explain why. Now, demai is fruits that you bought from an amaretz who we suspect did not take meiser. So on that, the machok is Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says no good, Beis Hillel says you could use it. And meiser sheni is something you can only use in Yerushalayim. So in Yerushalayim, the Gemara again says you should not use it, but if you did, it's kosher. Outside Yerushalayim, you definitely cannot use it because nothing you can do with it. Now, as far as the esrog itself, if it has blisters growing on it, so if it's growing on the majority of it, then it's pasul. If it's missing the pitum, that's the thorny stem that grows on the tip of the esrog, like a pomegranate, Rashi says, that is pasul. If it's peeled, cracked, has a hole which is missing, these are all psulim. Now, if the chazazis, if the blister grows on a minority of it, or it's missing the stem, there's a hole, meaning the stem is ripped off, there's not even any piece of the stem there, or if it has a hole in it and nothing's missing, just a hole that the esrog got poked but there's nothing lacking, then these are kosher. Further, a black esrog is pasul. A very green esrog, machlokas Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Reb Meir says it's kosher, Rabbi Yehuda says it's pasul. Now, what's the proper size of an esrog? The minimum and maximum size. We've seen this quoted earlier in the beginning of the parak. Smallest that an esrog could be, Rabbi Meir says, is the size of a walnut. Rabbi Yehuda says the size of an egg. The largest it could be, Rabbi Yehuda says, you have to be able to hold 2 in one hand. And Rabbi Meir says even if it takes 2 hands to hold just one, it's still.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.